He knew the rule. Every person in that village knew the rule. Never go to the farm at noon. He went anyway. He came back. But whatever came back wasn't entirely him. This is the story of Emeka, a name that means great deeds in his people's tongue, a young farmer who believed that superstition was just another word for ignorance. He was wrong, and by the time he understood that, it was too late to be what he used to be. Picture a village on the edge of a vast forest, somewhere in the heart of West Africa, where the air smells of wet earth and wood smoke and something older than both. The kind of place where the soil is so dark and so deep that people say it isn't just ground, it's memory. Every root that drinks from it drinks from those who came before. The village of Uzo, which roughly means a path, as in the path between worlds, had survived for generations because of one thing. They knew what to remember. They remembered the stories, the warnings, the rules, and the most important rule, the one carved into every child's understanding before they could even read, was this: never go to the ancestral farm at noon. Not at 12. Not close to 12. At noon, you put down your hoe. You stepped off the soil. You went home. You ate. You rested. And you did not ask why. The farm itself sat just beyond the last cluster of houses, stretching wide and ancient. A plot of land that had been worked by the same family's hands for more generations than anyone could count. The soil was impossibly fertile. Yam mounds that swelled like small hills, corn that grew so tall it seemed to lean toward the sun with something like hunger. But it belonged, as the elders said, to the living and the dead equally. And at noon, it belonged only to the dead. Emeka had been hearing this his whole life. He had decided, around age 22, that it was nonsense. Now here's the thing about Emeka. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't lazy. If anything, he was the opposite of lazy, which was half his problem. He was the kind of young man who woke before the sun, who worked until his shoulders ached, who read everything he could get his hands on and asked questions that made elders uncomfortable. He had an education. He had ambition. He had plans. And somewhere along the way, he had made a decision that a lot of smart, driven people make, a dangerous decision. He had confused knowing more with knowing better. We all know someone like this. Maybe you've been this person. The one who rolls their eyes at tradition, who hears, "This is how we've always done it," and thinks, well, maybe you've always done it wrong. There's actually something admirable in that impulse, the refusal to accept things without question. But there's a difference between questioning and dismissing, and Emeka had crossed that line. Old people and their stories, he'd mutter, half to himself, half loud enough to be heard, afraid of their own shadows, afraid of noon. What does the sun do at noon that it doesn't do at any other hour? His mother, Chidinma, a quiet woman with hands rough from decades of work and eyes that held something like sorrow permanently, would watch him speak this way and say nothing. She had tried when he was young. She had told him what her mother told her, and what her mother's mother had said before that. There are things that live in the in-between, things that once were human. And noon is the in-between hour, the moment when the sun stands directly above, casting no shadow. When nothing is a shadow, the boundary between the living and the dead goes thin as paper. Emeka would nod politely, and then go right back to not believing her. The year Emeka turned 26, two things happened. First, the rains came late, terrifyingly late. The kind of late that makes farmers stare at the sky with something between prayer and desperation, because a late rain isn't just an inconvenience. It's the difference between eating and not eating, between staying and leaving, between a community holding together and slowly falling apart. Second, and this is the part that set everything in motion, Emeka's father died. His name was Chukwemeka, and he had worked that ancestral farm for 30 years. He was not a complicated man. He kept the rules. He left the farm at noon, without fail, every single day of his farming life. And when the illness came for him, swift and unannounced, the land passed to his son. Now Emeka owned the farm. And Emeka had debts. You know how this works. The same way it works anywhere in the world. A young person inherits something from a parent, and along with the inheritance comes a weight of what the parent owed. Medical costs, loans from neighbors, small amounts that add up to something that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning. Emeka needed a harvest, a good one, a fast one. And the farm, his farm now, needed more hours of work than the rules currently allowed. "I'll just work through noon," he told himself one evening, looking out at the mounds. "One time, just to get ahead. Nothing is going to happen." He almost convinced himself. Almost. What he didn't expect was that the oldest woman in the village would be waiting for him on his path home that night. Her name was Mama Nena, which simply means grandmother's mother, a title of such age that it doubles back on itself. She was old enough that no one could agree on exactly how old she was. Old enough as she had become, in the way that truly ancient people sometimes do, less like a person and more like a landmark, something you oriented yourself around. She was sitting on a low stool outside her doorway with her eyes closed. Emika almost walked past her. "Emika," she said without opening her eyes. He stopped. "You are thinking about the farm," she said. Not a question. He shifted his weight. "Just planning the week, Mama." "You are thinking about noon," she said. Something cold moved through him, and he hated himself for it. Superstition is contagious, he thought. That's all this is. "Mama," he said, carefully respectful in the way you are with elderly people even when you think they're wrong. "I appreciate the tradition, but I'm a grown man, and this is my farm now. My father is gone. I need—" "Your father," she interrupted, still not opening her eyes, "kept that farm for 30 years. Not because he was afraid, because he understood what he did not see." Now she opened her eyes, dark, ancient, steady as stones in a river. "There's a difference." "What actually happens at noon?" he asked, the challenge in his voice careful but present. "Has anyone ever actually seen it? Can anyone tell me specifically?" "The ones who saw it," she said quietly, "are still there." A long silence. "The farm gives," she continued. "It gives because we respect what it holds." "You stop giving respect." She didn't finish the sentence. She closed her eyes again. "Go home, Emika. Eat, sleep, leave the noon hours to those they belong to." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he thanked her. Then he went home. He told himself he had made no decision yet. He had. He'd made it before he ever spoke to her. 3 days later, Emika was on the farm at 11:45 in the morning. He had told himself he would leave by 11:30. Then 11:45. Then, well, he was almost done with this row. 5 more minutes wouldn't hurt. The sun was high and hot, and his body was already soaked with sweat, and the mounds were looking good, and he was so close to finishing. And then the bird stopped. You know that moment in a horror movie. And yes, this is a story that earns that comparison. When the music stops, when everything gets too quiet, and the air changes, and your body knows something before your brain catches up, that's what happened at noon on the ancestral farm of Yuzo. The birds went silent. Every last one. The insects, the constant hum that you stop noticing because it's always there, that stopped too. The wind, which had been stirring the corn gently, dropped dead, and the shadows vanished. Every shadow, the one Emika cast, the shadow of the corn stalks, the shadow of the yam mounds, all of it gone. The sun sat directly above like an eye that refuses to blink, and the world beneath it was flat and shadowless and utterly, profoundly wrong. Emika straightened up slowly from his work. He told himself it was just the angle of the sun. He told himself he was overheated, and his eyes were playing tricks. And then the soil moved, not like an earthquake, not violently, slowly. The way dough rises when something living inside it pushes upward. One mound, then another, then a third. Emika's hoe dropped from his hand. His feet would not move, and he would later think that this was mercy, because if he'd been able to run, he would have, and he would have missed what he saw, and then perhaps he would have remained a man he used to be. The soil cracked, and from the cracks, hands emerged. Dark, earth-covered hands, reaching up the way a person reaches for help out of deep water. But there was no panic in the motion. It was slow, patient, inevitable, like watching something that has happened 1,000 times before, in a place where no witness was supposed to be. The hands found the surface, and then the people followed them. They rose from the soil like they were being born from it, which Emika would later understand they were, fully formed, their skin the deep brown-black of the earth itself, their clothing ancient, woven from materials that didn't exist anymore, their faces carved with lines that weren't age. They were time itself pressed into skin. They were not ghosts. That's the important thing. They were not transparent or glowing or any of the things that Western stories, movies, books have taught us to expect from the dead. They were solid. They were present. They had weight. There were dozens of them, rising from every part of the farm, moving through the rows with the slow, certain grace of people who are exactly where they belong. And they were farming, working the soil, turning it, patting the mounds, checking the roots, doing what generations of hands had done on this exact ground since before anyone living could remember. Silent, unhurried, together, Emeka stood among them, and none of them looked at him. For almost a full minute, he was invisible to them. And then one did look up. The one who saw him was an old man, ancient in the way Mama Nena was ancient, but somehow older still. He had Emeka's father's jaw, the same forehead, the same hands, wide-palmed and scarred from decades of honest work. But it wasn't his father. The old man looked at Emeka with an expression that had no cruelty in it, and no warmth either. It was a look of someone who had expected this, and was merely sad about it, in the way you can be sad about something that is already decided. He opened his mouth. No sound came, not in any language Emeka could hear, but he felt the words settle into him like water into cracked ground. You did not stay away. Emeka's throat had closed entirely. He wanted to speak. He wanted to explain the debts, the late rains, the pressure, the very reasonable logic that had led him to this exact moment of standing in a field full of the risen dead. You did not stay away. The feeling came again. And so now you stay. No. Emeka finally managed. It came out barely a whisper. No, I need to go home. My mother is... The old man looked down at the soil, and Emeka felt it, starting at his feet, not pain, but weight, a heaviness, the kind that starts in the soles and climbs, slow and certain, the feeling of roots finding purchase. He looked down. The soil around his feet was moving inward, pulling. Now, if this were a simpler story, a different kind of story, there would be a dramatic escape, a last-second rescue. Someone would arrive, his mother, Mama Nena, some spirit protector, and pull him free. He would go home shaking, forever changed but fundamentally intact, and the lesson would be neat and contained. That is not the story. Because the real terror of this moment wasn't the soil rising. It wasn't the figures moving calmly around him, back to their work as if his fate was already settled. It wasn't even the pulling sensation climbing from his feet to his ankles, up toward his knees. The real terror was that he understood. We all have that moment, don't we? The moment in the middle of a consequence when we stop bargaining and just know. When the mind goes very quiet and very clear and we see, with perfect brutal honesty, exactly how we arrived here. Emeka saw it. Every dismissal, every rolled eye, every polite thank you to an elder followed by a private smirk. Every time he had chosen the clean comfort of his own logic over the lived experience of people who had walked this ground for decades before he was born, he hadn't been questioning tradition. He had been disrespecting people. People who had earned their wisdom the hard way. People who knew things he didn't. Not because they were foolish or superstitious, but because they had paid attention. The soil was at his knees now. He was not screaming. He couldn't explain why. Only that screaming felt disrespectful. Somehow, like screaming in a place of worship. I'm sorry, he said, out loud, to the farm, to the figures around him, to the old man who still watched him with those sad, decided eyes. I'm sorry. I thought I knew. The old man tilted his head slightly, listening. I thought knowing more meant knowing better, Emeka said. His voice cracked. But I didn't know anything. I didn't know what you knew. I didn't ask. I just decided you were wrong. The soil had reached his waist. He looked up at the sky, still shadowless, still that terrible noon white, and he thought about his mother, Chidinma, her rough hands, her sorrow, the way she had tried to tell him, the way he had nodded and moved on. "I'm sorry," he said again. Not as a bargain, not as a strategy. Just because it was true, and truth was the only thing he had left to give. The pulling stopped. It didn't reverse. That's important. He didn't simply rise back up, free and forgiven, the way we like our redemptions to work. Quick, clean, cost-free. The soil held him where it had him, waist-deep, rooted, and then something changed in the quality of the air, the way it changes just before rain. Something arrived in the silence, a presence, older than any of the figures around him, older than the farm, older than the village. He felt it move through him like a current. He felt them move through him. Generations of his own family, not as visions, not as voices, but as knowing, flashes of understanding that weren't his own. A great-grandmother whose name no one living remembered, who had carried twins across a flooded river. A grandfather who had starved for a season, so his children could eat. A great-great-uncle who had once planted this exact soil with his bare hands and wept at the harvest. He felt their calluses. He felt their pride. Not his kind. Not the brittle pride of a young man who thinks he's smarter than the people around him. Their pride was quieter, earned over decades. The pride of people who had stayed, who had worked, who had respected what was given to them, and tended what was trusted to them. The soil began to release him, but slowly, and not all of him came back. He walked home in the late afternoon light, casting a long shadow behind him. His mother was sitting on the step, as if she'd been there all day. Maybe she had. She looked at his face and made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite relief, and reached for him, and he held her for a long moment without saying anything. "I went at noon," he said finally. She didn't ask what had happened. Mothers who have been warning their children their whole lives don't need the story confirmed. They just need to know their child came back. "Are you?" she started. "I came back," he said, "but I'm different." And this was simply true, in ways he would spend the rest of his life discovering. He could feel the farm now, not in any mystical movie magic sense. He hadn't become a supernatural being, hadn't been given powers. But when he walked through the rows, he felt the history of the soil beneath him. He knew, without being told, where his ancestors had planted and where they had rested and where they had buried small griefs and small joys into the ground. He understood the farm as a living document, not just as property. He kept the rules after that, without resentment, without condescension. He kept them the way you follow the guidance of someone you respect. Not because you fear the consequence, but because you understand that their knowledge is real even when you can't fully see it. Mama Nena came to see him the next morning. She sat across from him at the low table and looked at his face for a long time. "You saw them," she said. "Yes." "And they saw you." "Yes." She nodded slowly, the way very old people nod when something they've known for a long time finally gets confirmed. "Your grandfather saw them too," she said, "when he was young, before he understood." She paused. He didn't tell many people. He was ashamed of having needed the lesson. Emeka was quiet. "Maybe he shouldn't have been," he said finally. "Maybe the lesson is the point." Something like warmth moved across Mama Nena's face. Not quite a smile, but close enough. "The farm is still yours," she said. "They don't take what belongs to the living. They only recalibrate." She used a word in her language that he later understood meant something between correct and remind and restore. A word for the thing that happens when something has drifted from what it should be and is guided back. Emeka leaned back. "I spent so much time," he said slowly, "thinking that believing in things I couldn't explain was weakness, that people who followed the old rules were just afraid of the dark. And now," he thought about the figures rising from the soil, the terrible patience of them, the way they had moved through the rows with absolute certainty, tending what they had always tended. The old man with his father's jaw and his eyes full of quiet, unjudging sorrow. "I think," he said, "that I was afraid of the dark too. I just called it something different. I called it being rational. But I was really just afraid that if the old things were true, if the ancestors were real, if the land had memory, then I'd have obligations. And obligations feel heavy when you're young and you want to be free." He paused. "It's a lot easier to say the old people are wrong than to accept that you owe something to the past." Here's what this story knows that is hard to argue with. We live in a world right now that is extremely suspicious of old wisdom. And sometimes, rightly so, some old rules existed to oppress, to control, to keep people small. Questioning those rules is necessary and brave. But there's another category of old rule, the kind that isn't about control at all, the kind that exists because the people before you paid, in ways you can't fully see, for the knowledge of what happens when you don't follow it. The kind that isn't about fear, it's about memory, about a community's accumulated understanding of forces larger than any single person. And the terrifying thing about dismissing that wisdom as superstition is that you don't know, in the moment of dismissal, which kind of rule you're throwing away. Emeka mistook, "I don't understand this, for this isn't real." We all do it, just usually with lower stakes. Maybe it's advice from a parent who survived something you haven't. Maybe it's the experience of a mentor you're quietly certain you've already surpassed. Maybe it's the institutional knowledge of people who have been doing something for 30 years that you've been doing for 3. The farmers who rise from the soil at noon aren't only a supernatural truth in an ancient village. They're a metaphor for everything that returns, every consequence, every pattern, every truth. When we decide we're too smart to be careful, the soil remembers. It always does, whether we're ready for that or not. Emeka farmed that land for the rest of his long life. He became, over time, one of those people who hold a community together at the seams, not famous, not powerful, but known for the way he listened to the old women, for the way he passed stories on to children who would rather be looking at their phones. Except phones hadn't been invented yet, but the children who would rather be anywhere else but listening to an old person talk, they've always existed. He told them about noon. He told them about the figures in the soil. He told them exactly what he had felt when the earth began to swallow him, and he had finally understood. Some believed him, some didn't, but they all left the farm at noon. And Emeka, who had once been so certain that he was too intelligent for superstition, would watch them go, and he would feel something move through him that he now recognized as the presence of the people in the soil. Not haunting, just watching, just acknowledging. And he would nod, slowly, the way Mama Nene used to nod, the way people nod when something they've known for a long time finally gets confirmed. Here's what I keep coming back to with this story. Emeka wasn't a bad person. He wasn't even wrong to question. He was wrong to dismiss. And there's a distance between those two things that looks small from a comfortable distance, but feels enormous when you're waist deep in soil you shouldn't have stood on. We all have our noon hour, that moment or decision or boundary that someone wiser tried to warn us about, and we decided we knew better. Sometimes we get lucky and the consequences are light. Sometimes we get our own version of the ancestral farm, something that holds us, changes us, sends us home different. The question isn't whether the warning was superstition or not. The question is this: what do you do with wisdom you don't yet understand? Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever dismissed someone's advice, ignored a warning, and then lived to regret it? What did it cost you? And more importantly, what did it teach you? Because these stories, these warnings passed down through generations across the African continent. They weren't born from fear. They were born from experience. From someone a long time ago who stood exactly where Emeka stood and came back with something worth passing on. There are thousands more stories like this one, each one older than the last, each one carrying something that survives every century it passes through, because the truth inside it doesn't age. Stick around. There's more where this came from.